Go watch Made in China. We play ping pong ball.
So hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host Jordan Schneider. Today we're here with Houze, a research fellow at the Paulson Institute. He also is a xiaoyou of mine, having graduated from Peking University with a BA in economics. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me here.
First, I'm curious to ask you what first got you interested in studying economics and economic reform?
It's really reading Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. I think before I read that book, I really have no idea that actually the economic and political side of the society, they're actually connected. And especially, I really didn't appreciate the importance of economic policy and the choices about economic policy on the welfare of a society. And this really built up my interest in economic policy.
So you've been working in the States for a number of years now. Could you comment a little bit about the difference between studying China within the country versus studying it from abroad, and maybe some of the advantages and disadvantages that come with both locations?
I think for myself, I think the greatest benefit or the most useful lesson to me is really to realize that actually Chinese economy is not that exceptional. So China maybe I think it's not just China, basically each country has each unique institutional environment, institutional settings. But really the underlying economic mechanism has been basically, I think, the same for every country. So for example, I think anyone who is familiar with a history of financial crisis, I think should be able to really to understand the vulnerabilities in China's financial system and the root cause really easily.
Is there anything in particular you've noticed American commentators miss, you think, when looking at China economic reforms?
I think this is not just limited to Western commentators. It's also to some degree of presented in Chinese among Chinese analysts as well. I think just it seems to me that most people, I think that's actually correct, that assume that because Beijing is so powerful than basically any other government, so that actually makes people to spend, to me, I think that probably spend too much time at guessing or interpreting Beijing's policy intentions. And I think the flip side is really that sometimes it just oversees the possibility that Beijing will not get what it wants, or even if Beijing eventually achieves what it wants, it may come with either very large cost or lead to some unforeseen consequences. Example would be like, for example, Beijing's goal of promoting direct finance, which basically means let borrowers to borrow from through either bond or equity. So this is really to diversify the risk out of China's banking sector. But in the meantime, China has very insufficient protection of creditors. So under such an underdeveloped corporate governance environment, you should not expect that the direct financing can expand overnight in China. And actually, for example, the recent stock market crash in 2015 is really the direct result of Chinese government trying to use a big push or like great leap forward approach to develop its equity market, and it's really end up very ugly and comes with very large social costs.
So that's a great transition into our main topic for today, which is your provincial spotlight series, particularly its first few episodes on Liaoning. So Liaoning is a province in China's Rustbelt, and I'm curious if you could, or I'd like you to set the stage a little bit and tell our audience why it's important to look at provinces like this and how they can sort of act and how they may or may not act as a bellwether for China's future growth.
I think the direct reason is back in last September, there was a widely circulated and actually kind of a controversial report on how Jilin, which is actually one of the three northeast provinces, and which is actually next to Liaoning. And that report is about how Jilin can escape from its current economic stagnation and how to better develop its economy, especially what government can do to help to promote the local economic development. And that report is controversial in that it's actually its main policies recommendation is that not the root cause for the economic stagnation in the Northeast area is really simply that the Northeast area has too much heavy industry like steel and like auto, but they have not enough like light industry, and that is very like unconventional, and many people disagree with that. So there's a very lively debate back in last September, and that was just the time I started to begin working on this provincial snapshot series. So, and by the way, I'm also originally from the Northeast area. So it's basically those two reasons that lead me to write Liaoning as the first piece, the first area in this series.
So could you give our readers a sense of what the Chinese Rust Belt is and how it's sort of lost importance in the overall China economic puzzle?
Yeah, it actually used to be the strongest local economy back in the central planning days. Basically, that's between early 1950 to late 1970. During that time, because actually before China started central planning, the Northeast economy already have a much more advanced and larger industrial sector than the rest of the country. And actually, this advantage has been further strengthened during the central planning era. But actually, this comes with two significant long-term consequences. The first is really the expansion of the SOE sector. So basically, by the end of the at the start of China's market reform in the early 1980s, basically all Liaoning's industrial economy is within the state sector. This is in comparison, for example, in areas like in the south, for example, like Zhejiang or Jiangsu. They also have some SOEs, but they also have many like smaller but more market-oriented enterprises. Those that formed by the rural collectives, which later been called township enterprises, and has been the driver of China's economic growth in both the 80s and the 90s. So the first negative consequences from the planning economy era is really the SOE, and the second is really also the central planning basically restructured the Northeast economy in a way that basically each city is organized just around one or a handful of flagship SOEs. The consequences of this is really that this is significantly reduced the diversification in local economy. So basically tie the fortune of this city to just one SOE. And to me, I think basic SOE and this lack of diversification are really two leading factors that contribute to the economic stagnation in this area.
So could you talk now about Shenyang Machine Tool and how it serves as a case study for the failures of SOE reform over the past few years?
I think in order to understand the case of Shenyang Machine Tool, I think you need to first understand Beijing's objectives for SOEs. Actually, I think from Beijing's perspective, actually Shenyang Machine Tool doesn't account as a failure. So it accounts as a failure in the conventional business sense. But basically, that form was near the edge of default. It actually didn't default on its debt, but it's very close to default. I think the debt to asset ratio is something like more than 90%. And I think back in last summer, I think it was actually bailed out by the state banks. So basically, it has went through a so-called debt to equity swap. That basically the banks swapped like tens of billions of debt into equities, and the immediate benefit is that the Shenyang Machine 2 no longer needs to pay interest on those debts. So, but yeah, that's from a conventional perspective. Yeah, Shenyang Machine 2 counts as failure. But I think from Beijing's perspective, I don't think really Shenyang Machine 2 counts as failure, because ultimately, I think Chinese government's objective SOE, or their position for SOE, is really that they want to use SOE as a reliable and effective a tool to both influence and control economy. So that requires the SOE sector should remain influential in the economy, and that influence can either come from size or come from, say, market power. Many of the SOEs they are monopolies, and also actually technology is also can be used as a source of SOE influence. And exactly here, I think Shenyang Machine 2, on the one hand, it lose a huge amount of money, I think, during the last 5-6 years. But on the other hand, it also managed to achieve some breakthrough in the digital machine tool manufacturing. I think under Beijing's calculation, actually, Shenyang Machine 2's technology breakthrough actually matters more than the billions loss it has accumulated over the years.
So is this a smart idea for Beijing to be prioritizing this, or what are the downsides of this sort of thinking about how to promote industrial innovation?
I think, just as I said, I think industrial policy is part of Beijing's consideration. I think on a higher level, just as I said, I think the SOE is fundamentally is that SOE needs to remain influential enough so that the Chinese government can, through its control over SOEs, to control and influence the economy. So actually, this is not simply a matter of how much money SOE made, because I think actually profitability actually doesn't matter that much to Beijing. I think just if you just closely examine the Chinese SOE reform during the past 2 decades, I think only when SOEs become a significant burden on the state fiscal position, only during times like this, that when SOE is about to cause like a fiscal crisis, that Beijing will impose like hard discipline on SOEs and really reform those SOEs. But otherwise, as long as SOEs basically can remain in business, so even if that means their for example, either their profitability or their return on assets is really low, much lower than their private peers, I think Beijing will accept that, as long as the SOE is firmly in the hands of the Chinese government, and second, that is maintain an influential role in the economy. So that's really what I see.
So can you talk a little bit about how this power is actually used in practice, and the sort of corporate governance structures of these entities?
Actually, I think I recently began to be interested in these topics because there been a trend that actually to empowering a party committee within SOEs. SOEs has historically always have a party committee, but I don't think that in any time in the past 20 years that SOE party committee has been promoted to such or be empowered to the current extent. So basically, I think for example, if you look at the Communist Party's constitution, actually, the word describing the rule of party committee within SOE is that basically that as SOE party committee has the ultimate say on basically all major decisions within that SOE. Previously, I think as recent as probably as 5 years ago, the trend has been that SOE party committee will continue to exist, but it will function through cooperative board. Basically, that those many of those SOE party committee members will also have seat on SOE board, and they basically they exercise their power through board. But now this has taken a sudden change. This basically places SOE party committee above SOE corporate board. So I think that's actually something new and something that different than even like 5 years ago. So basically, under the current SOE power structure, is that the SOE party committee is above SOE corporate board, and although SOE corporate board still has the authority to oversee SOE management, but actually, as in most SOE. In most SOEs, SOE management and SOE party committee, they are the same group of people. So basically, this is very different than the conventional corporate governance structure where you put board above management. Actually, this is equivalent to you put SOE management above SOE board.
So one of the other reasons you write about Liaoning having a problem is the fact that it's one of the provinces that it's particularly hard to do business in. So there's some saying, never invest north of Shanhaiguan, which is a river. Recently, the struggles of business owners in the Chinese Rustbelt has been in the news, where Mao Zhenhua, who's the chairman of a ski resort, posted a video of himself complaining about party interference with his ski enterprises. So could you talk a little bit about this video, the reaction it had, and what it says about the broader business environment and frustration of business owners in Northeast China?
I think actually to the Chinese public, I think that is actually doesn't account as news. This is basically reconfirm their previous perception of the bad investment climate in China's northeast area. As for the original why this area has such a terrible business environment, I think there are many explanations ranging from say culture to just the legacy from the central planned economy era. I think actually my preferred explanation for this is actually because the northeast area actually lags behind other areas in terms of openness. Openness here, I mean like the share of export and imports in the economy. As I choose to use openness to explain the terrible investment climate, because I think actually when the economy is relied on the export, actually this has effectively introduced a ceiling on how taxing the local government can be. Here, by taxing, I mean both like tax like corporate income tax, but also like red tapes and regulatory barriers. So if the local environment is too taxing, actually, then the local product will not be competitive in the international market, and actually the local economy will collapse. But in many of the northeast areas, actually their demand is actually mostly domestic and locally oriented. So that's actually to the government. Actually, for example, when the majority of the local products are consumed locally, or for example are domestically, and local governments actually can force, for example, consumers to just buy domestic produce goods, but they cannot, for example, force like international consumers to buy their local products. So actually, because, for example, in Heilongjiang's case, Heilongjiang is a province where this ski resort located in. I think export actually only account for like 2% or less than 3% in the Heilongjiang economy. The average figure for the Chinese economy, I think, is something close to 20%. It's probably now a little bit lower, but it's definitely still higher than 15%. So Heilongjiang is extremely close when you measure by trade, and actually I think this really makes the local government not care so much about the local business environment, because they know that regardless of what they do, that local people, unless they leave, of course, local people can eventually vote with feet. And that's actually happening in the China's northeast area. But it will be a very gradual process. But in the meantime, local governments still can just use their power to force people to consume the poor quality goods, including here in this case the ski resort, the services ski. The state-owned ski resort provided. So actually, I think this is really the source or the origin of the poor investment climate in this area.
So one of the things you touched on there was depopulation, which has a parallel, of course, to America's Rustbelt. So are there any initiatives to keep young, enterprising graduates to stay in the country? What is the government trying to do to reverse this trend? And do you think they have any hopes for success?
Actually, some of the larger cities in that area, say like Shenyang, I think they have policies and incentives to recent graduates if they choose to relocate to Shenyang. But I really don't think it will matter much, because I think there are actually two forces at work at the same time. One is the lack of economic opportunities, and including the bad investment climate. This will stop people from moving to the northeast area. The other is really the local low fertility rate. And actually, there are two forces at work at the same time, and I think it will be a really achievement if you can eventually overturn any one of them. And right now, the northeast area needs to overcome those two nearly impossible tasks. I think I'm not very optimistic about that.
Presumably, this sort of news story making it into the national and international media, you don't expect to change anything.
Actually, this time, the Heilongjiang provincial government has been very responsive. They basically send an inspection team basically the next day, and within a week, the report comes that basically actually support this entrepreneur, this private ski resort owner's claim that the local government has violated its property rights. But as to maybe in this particular case, actually the involvement of the provincial government will help to mitigate the conflicts and stop the local government from interfering in the operation and the property rights of this ski resort. But by and large, I think as to whether this will help to improve the business environment in that entire region, I'm not optimistic, because this is actually not news. Actually, I think most Chinese people, their perception of the northeast area has been this for like at least 20, 30 years. So yeah, so it's really not something new, and I really don't think that it can soon change for the good.
So on a prior episode, we spoke about the politics of protest, how there's some sense within the Chinese government that having that letting people be able to have a voice and and voice their concerns about the government is actually a good way for the government to get feedback on what's working and not working. So I'm curious, if you owned a business in Heilongjiang or you were a business consultant, would you recommend that a factory owner that was having problems with the government record their own rant and put it up on Weibo? Or do you think this was a particularly risky move on the part of the ski resort owner?
I think first, actually, this particular entrepreneur, Mao Chenhua, he's very famous. He's a very famous businessman in China. So if you are just an average businessman, so even if you manage to post your rant, say on social media, I think most people will just not care, because this is actually, as I said, this is just a typical phenomenon in that area. So people will not take this as news or pay a particular attention to that.
Okay, so I need a few million followers before I use this tack to wring out some tax incentives or get the inspectors off my back.
Exactly.
So another development in the news recently has been provinces and cities revising their GDP numbers down. Liaoning actually kicked this trend off back in 2017, where it changed its numbers. So could you talk a little bit about this development?
Yes, actually, even before the review that Liaoning government has been exaggerating both its GDP and fiscal income and industrial value-added numbers. This has been widely known that economic statistics, especially at the provincial level, they are probably not very reliable. One simple test is really you just add up all the provincial level GDP and you compare it with the national level GDP. And I think still to the year 2016, the sum of the provincial number is still like something like 4 or 5% larger than the national number. And if you look at some of the subcomponents, for example, GDP you can break down into consumption, investment, and actually if you just look at the investment component, you will find actually it's more astonishing that the sum of the local investment figure is actually something like 30% greater than the national figure. And in absolute terms, that's like a near 9 trillion yuan gap. So actually, this is entirely not a surprise that for example, some of those provinces, they have been over-reporting, for example, their investment expenditures or industrial output. But however, there's another actually interesting fact that has been revealed both in the Liaoning and in the later Inner Mongolia and Tianjin case, is the fact that actually industrial value-added data has also been manipulated by local government. So this is why this is particularly important, is that actually for all the industrial firms above a certain size, actually all their financial data are directly reported to the National Bureau of Statistics. And the purpose of designing this system, of this direct reporting system, is really to limit the influence of local government in this process. But still, it's kind of like, at least to me, it comes as a surprise that even with this direct reporting system, that's the central authority directly collect those data from this industrial firms, that you still have such widespread data exaggeration and manipulation, and that's kind of like a surprise to me.
So, what are the incentives of the officials who are inflating these numbers?
Oh, I think for one thing, is actually that GDP and economic growth still matters greatly. To the political career of those local governments, and especially you need to take this into consideration is that actually when basically every city or every every county is exaggerating numbers. For example, you just to appear that your region is an average player, it probably will require you to manipulate the data. So, and another, actually, you're talking about political incentives. Actually, another interesting thing about the recent data revision is that actually all those exact data manipulation has been revealed just shortly after the power transition at each of those provinces, both in the case of Liaoning, Liaoning, Inner Mongolia, and Tianjin. In Liaoning, basically, they removed the former provincial party secretary in early 2015, and basically soon afterwards, they have began to revise Liaoning's economic data down. And in Inner Mongolia also, I think Inner Mongolia replaced its party secretary, I think, back in 2016. And actually, and the recent news revealed that actually all the data exaggerations are basically happening under the tenure of the previous party secretary. So after the revision, the benefit to the new party secretary is really that it will have a much lower base, and to some extent, it will make future economic statistics looks better.
Sounds like a good plan.
Yeah.
So is there a broader trend at work, or is it just more these individual party secretaries deciding that they don't want to have to they want to make their numbers look better going forward?
I think actually it is, because actually the background is that actually the past decades for China is basically a decade of exceptional high investment growth. For many years, fixed investment has grown at something like 20%. And investment as a share of GDP has been close to 50%. So, and actually under that type of environment, so you naturally have some provinces, they want to appear even more impressive than the national average, and they'll have incentives to manipulate their numbers. And actually, if you, for example, to just simply plot a chart, for example, of the share of investment in each of these provinces, you will see in most cases there's a significant jump around 2009. But some provinces, shortly afterwards, they began a reversing trend. For example, many of the southern provinces, but many the other provinces, because probably they have a less healthy economy, they choose just to maintain this investment driving growth model. So many years after the China's 2009 fiscal stimulus, and the result is really the current overstated investment numbers. And actually, I think to some extent, those are not purely manipulated. There are in some sense, I think there are actually some of the numbers they reflect at least partially the reality that actually investment has been growing at exceptional rate in those provinces during the past 5-10 years. So but now it has been all blamed on the previous party secretaries and their wrongdoings. But I think that claim is also kind of like extreme. I think a fair assessment is that part of it is manipulation, over-reporting, and part of it just reflects the unhealthy economic fundamentals, economic structure of China in the past decade.
So this is a good transition to the national level. As you know, there's been some talk of Xi and Beijing giving up the national GDP growth target, but that turned out to not be the case as of now. One of the things you do as well at Macropolo is write a reform tracker. So maybe for our first reform, we could talk about national GDP targeting and what the recent announcements and news around this means for economic policy going forward.
Okay. I think the way to understand this is first thing is that I think China still maintains the Chinese government they will still honor their pledge to double GDP between 2010 to 2020, and I think the official calculation suggests in the next 3 years that will require a 6.3% annual growth, which is slightly lower than the average growth in the past 3 years. For example, this year's growth number is probably something around 6.9, so 6.3 is something like 0.6% lower. So actually, this gives there some room to do some to introduce some of those short-term painful but long-term beneficial reforms. But as to whether they will introduce or reform, the pace of reform will pick up in the next 3 years, I'm actually not very sure, because the top 3 policy priorities for next 3 years is number 1, address financial vulnerabilities, and number 2, reduction of poverty, and number 3, to address pollution. And actually, based on their current approach, for example, both in the case of addressing financial regulation tightening or environment, it seems that overwhelmingly that both the central and local government, they choose to use short-term fix or rely on primarily state-based approach, rather than, for example, as a reform will require that will introduce more market-based mechanism or use more market-based approach. So I'm not sure that whether reform, especially market reform, will really pick up in the next 3 years. But there are reasons to be at least maybe cautiously optimistic about this. But I'm not completely sure.
So in general, let's close on a sort of broader question about how to follow these issues. So one of the challenges on studying economic reform is separating the smoke from the fire and really understanding to what extent announced reforms are real or will end up panning out. So do you have any advice out there, or what are your best practices for trying to really understand the prospects of various reforms?
I think by reform, I think my understanding of reform that it needs to bring long-term positive institutional changes. Basically means those reform measures, they need to have long-term consequences. An opposite example is that Chinese government current approach to tackle Beijing's air pollution problem. Actually, they achieved their target, which is really impressive. But the approach they're using, for example, by simply shutting down all the construction activities in the northern part of China during the entire winter, I think that's first thing, that's not something that's very sustainable. You cannot expect that the construction activity to be shut down during winter forever in the future. That's number one. And number two, actually, this by relying through those short-term fixes, it actually comes with a cost that you tend to use less of those and to focus less on the root cause. For example, in this case, the northern area's air quality has improved greatly, but their energy mix has not changed that much. So yeah, so that's basically number one, that to assess whether this particular measures has short-term consequences or it's simply a short-term fix. Number two is really implementation. I think on this, researchers or analysts they have to really just follow how this policy being implemented in the coming months and years. A good example is really China's local government debt reform. Basically, the institutional foundation for local government debt reform has already been in place by early 2015, but it has just not been very well implemented. So, and actually it has, and the ironically that even after the implementation of this local fiscal reform, actually local government debt become even less under control than previously. So that's the number one factor. But this, you have to just, there's not much you can know beforehand. So you have to follow closely and see whether this piece of policy got implemented in practice.
Thanks so much for that advice. So we're looking to have you on for the next provincial snapshot. Do you want to give our listeners a preview of what are the next provinces you might be thinking about writing on?
I'm actually thinking about Guangdong province. And my reason is that first thing is that Guangdong is, as widely known, that it's most dynamic, and actually is also the largest local economy in China. And actually in many areas is like 5 to 10 years ahead of the other areas. For example, one thing that I want to study is Guangdong's industrial upgrading effort. Basically, Guangdong is probably the first Chinese provinces that announced that it needs to upgrade its economic structure. Means that it needs to push its local firms to climb up the value chain. So you should not just focus. So in other words, an example is that Guangdong government probably back in 10 years ago already announced their goal is basically to have like more Apple-like companies in Guangdong rather than just Foxconn. So I really want to examine what Guangdong has achieved in this, and what lessons it can be drawn for the rest of China. And the second is actually, it's a kind of like a economic history related topic. It's really the resolution of those so-called window companies back in the late 90s after the Asian financial crisis. Those window companies, they are actually all SOEs. They were created back in the 80s. To help Chinese local government, especially the local government in the coastal areas, to attract capital and technology from abroad. So that's why they are called, in Chinese term, called window company. They're basically serving as a window so that new technology and foreign capital can come in through this window. But actually, in reality, many of those window companies, eventually they become very familiar, very similar to the current local government financial vehicles. So basically, they are all accumulate enormous amount of debt, and actually by the time of the Asian financial crisis, and especially after the Asian financial crisis and the financing condition has been tightening in the international market, many of those window companies, because they are based in Hong Kong and they borrowed in Hong Kong and from abroad, actually they have encountered both liquidity and in many cases solvency problems. So many of them are on the verge of bankruptcy. There are two high-profile cases, both in Guangdong. In the first case, it's a trust company, and it actually got closed down. And in the second case, it's just an SOE conglomerate. In that case, actually, China's the current Wang Qishan, who had just retired from the standing committee, actually. He made his name through his resolution of that cases. So and I really want to study the resolution of those so-called window companies, those highly indebted SOEs, and see what lessons is there to for the current resolution of local government off-budget borrowing platforms. So that's basically 2 topics I currently have.
Great. Well, looking forward to having you back on and discuss those. Thanks so much for your time.